Good morning, Dog Nation. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Many of you were with us last night. Thanks for waking up and being with us again here this morning as we continue to react to the news that's out there that Jim Chaney has taken the Tennessee offensive coordinator job, leaving Georgia, apparently getting a big raise in the process. We'll have more from Mike Griffith on that in today's show. We can also report, and we'll discuss this in a moment. Looks like Sam Pittman is going to stick around Georgia. That's the biggest news of all for many Dog fans because of the success that Pittman has had in creating a really good Georgia offensive line. So there's a lot to get to, facts to decipher, rumor and innuendo to work our way around. We're glad to have a chance to do that with you as DawgNation Daily begins right now.
Presented by DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
Do you remember on yesterday's show, we talked about how we were going to be calmer and have more fun and relax and sort of loosen up a little bit? That was fun while it lasted. Things are all back to normal here today as Georgia is now looking for a new offensive coordinator. Jim Chaney, first reported by 24/7 Sports, leaving Georgia to take the offensive coordinator job at Tennessee. And when you have a situation like this with a guy leaving a program like Georgia to go to one of Georgia's biggest rivals, there is going to be a lot of reaction and a lot to figure out in terms of what really happened here behind the scenes. We did a lot of this on video last night. It's great to get a chance to do this with you here this morning on both video, radio, and podcast. Let me dive into what I think has been about the most interesting piece of, additional news on this over the course of the last, 10 hours or so in terms of, why this goes down, what happens here. ESPN has a report last night on ESPN.com written by Chris Lowe, a guy who knows the SEC really well. And there was some initial, scuttlebutt about what Lowe had written because apparently, Lowe had some information about a potential disagreement, a little bit of a lack of cohesion between Georgia offensive coordinator Jim Chaney and quarterbacks coach James Coley. If you go to ESPN.com, though, and read that piece right now, you don't see that. But we Googled this last night around 11 p.m., and what's called the metadata on Google, which gives you an idea of the text in the page. In fact, I think I could show this to you here. When you look at the metadata on Google of this story from ESPN.com, here's a very interesting couple lines here. Initially, I guess, written by Chris Lowe, although not currently in the ESPN.com story. It says, this is via Google of the ESPN story that's up online right now with this text now removed. Sources told ESPN that Chaney, who had 2 years left on his 3-year contract at Georgia, had grown frustrated with co-offensive coordinator quarterbacks coach James Coley's involvement in game planning and play calling. That stands out, at least initially, when it was included in the text as a possible reason for why Chaney would want to go to Tennessee. Now, what do you make of all this? The fact that it was in the story, apparently at one point in time, and then taken out of the story? It just goes to show you that when you have a situation like this involving both Georgia and Tennessee, both sides are going to do their work to say, no, let me tell you what really happened. Here is the real story for why Chaney was at Georgia, now at Tennessee. Tennessee's going to have its side of the story. Georgia's going to have its side of the story. And when it comes to something like this not being included, if it is true, we don't know what Chaney and Coley could have been in disagreement over, other than the fact that maybe that Chaney didn't feel fully respected as the full-fledged offensive coordinator, giving the ascendancy of Coley. But even beyond that, we don't know why this was once in and suddenly not in. Did somebody say, hey, you didn't have permission to print that, or hey, that's not exactly how this went down? Is differing opinions when it comes to that kind of stuff. When we talked about this last night on the show, in sort of the immediate aftermath of this entire ordeal, that's kind of what I talked about there. That part of what Georgia's dealing with here is a PR campaign, and a lot of Georgia fans are going to want to believe that Chaney's departure, because let's face it, with a lot of Georgia fans, Chaney was not popular. A lot of Georgia fans are going to want to believe that Chaney's departure is tantamount to a firing. That Kirby Smart had grown tired of Chaney for some of the same reasons that many of you have grown tired of Chaney. I don't know how fully true that is. I'll explain, why later on, why that may not be quite as tidy as some Georgia fans want it to be. But there is at least now a growing body of evidence to support Georgia's side of this story, that this was more about Georgia not fighting very hard to keep Chaney than it was Tennessee swooping in, showing its muscle to bring Chaney in. Let me first of all point to a really good piece of reporting from DawgNation's Mike Griffith, who who was able to get some specifics on the contract that Chaney's expected to sign with the University of Tennessee. If you're once again watching on the screen, I'll show this to you. If not, I'll read it to you, and I'll invite you to check out the entire piece from Mike at DawgNation.com. Mike will also be with us a little bit later on the program. Mike wrote late last night that sources say Chaney has negotiated a deal with the Vols worth between $4.5 and $5 million over 3 years, a significant raise from the contract he has had in place that paid him $950,000 annually, $2.85 million over 3 years through June of 2021 at Georgia. Once again, that's Dog Nation's Mike Griffith. So for the Georgia fans who want to believe the Georgia side of the story, which is, listen, Georgia's not going to fight that hard to keep Jim Chaney. They're not in love with Jim Chaney. Mike's reporting on this would certainly seem to back that up a little bit because, as Connor Riley pointed out on Twitter last night, this is not going to make Chaney the highest paid offensive coordinator in college football, like $1.5 million per year. This is Georgia saying, listen, we like you. You're okay. We're not going to pay you $1.5 million a year. Mike's reporting on this would seem to back up the Georgia side that this is more about a desperate move for Tennessee than it is some sort of desperate flailing on the part of Georgia to keep Chaney at all costs. The other thing here that seems to also bolster the Georgia side of the story, and as we discussed last night, there was a lot of rumblings and concerns from Georgia fans that Chaney's departure might also mean bad news for his good friend on the Georgia staff, Sam Pittman. Backstory here, the Georgia offensive line coach is among the most successful position coaches in all of college football, and the reason why Chaney's here in the first place is because he is a guy that was able to work with Sam Pittman, a guy that Pittman wanted to work with. Pittman left Arkansas to come to Georgia when Kirby Smart was hired, and essentially, Chaney was one of those sort of hand-picked guys to get Pittman to come over. That was viewed as a major coup when it happened. It's proven to be an unbelievable boost to the Georgia program because of the recruiting work that Pittman's done along the offensive line and the success his offensive line has had on the field for Georgia. With Chaney leaving, there's obviously going to be a lot of concern that Pittman, who's been a bit of a journeyman in his career a bit too, that he might be also leaving as well, which would make the Chaney news look worse if it did jeopardize Sam Pittman's future at Georgia. But now we've got some good reporting from Jeff Sintel at DawgNation that puts those fears to rest. Let me read this to you once again from Jeff's piece, and for more detail on this, I'd invite you to check out the full piece from Jeff Sintel at DawgNation.com. Jeff writes that Pittman is not expected to leave to coach the offensive line at Tennessee. Now listen to this sentence. The same can be said in regard to Alabama's interest in him as well. I'll be pausing Jeff's quote here and remind you that Brent Key is thought to maybe be leaving Alabama to take a position at Georgia Tech. That's been reported by the AJC. If Key leaves, the offensive line position would be open at Alabama. Pittman is also good friends with Dan Enos, who's thought to be the next offensive coordinator for the Crimson Tide. So it's more than just a Tennessee issue for Pittman. It could potentially be Alabama as well. Jeff says at DawgNation, in a story you can read right now, that neither of those scenarios are going to take place. Jeff writes, a source close to that situation has told DawgNation Pittman plans to return as offensive line coach for the 2019 season. Once again, that's Jeff Sintel from DawgNation.com. So in the immediate aftermath of what happened last night with Jim Chaney leaving, there's a lot of concern of, does this represent a Georgia program on the offensive side of the ball kind of falling apart? Justin Fields just transferred. Georgia missed out on a high-profile recruit like five-star wide receiver Jaden Hazelwood. Jim Chaney now leaving for Tennessee. Is this Chaney dissatisfied with Georgia? A lot of Georgia fans are going to step up and say, no. This is an example of maybe Georgia being dissatisfied with Jim Chaney. The truth on this may actually be somewhere in the middle, but the overall evidence to suggest that Georgia's going to be just fine after all of this is certainly starting to grow. Georgia did not apparently want to match a $1.5 million offer for Chaney, as DawgNation has reported, and is maybe going to give some more money to Sam Pittman in order to keep him. That's an arrangement I think works out just fine for Georgia fans. If there's money to be granted here, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to give that money to Chaney in the hopes of keeping Pittman when you could just give that money to Sam Pittman to begin with. So overall, if you're a Georgia fan who initially was worried about the news involving Jim Chaney, maybe some of the new news that follows up after this maybe gives you reason not to be quite so worried after all. And the process of Georgia maintaining its perch near the top of college football, it certainly seems like Georgia's in a pretty good position to kind of roll on with that. My name is Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're live on video this morning and glad to have you with us. 10 a.m., DawgNation Facebook, YouTube, Twitter feed. We're also on the radio at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Rev and in podcast form, wherever podcasts can be found. Glad to have you with us today. We'll have more on Mike Griffith's reporting in just a moment when he joins us live here on DawgNation Daily. I'll also remind you as well that we had a great time last night, at least before the Chaney news broke, right there in our laps while we were there at Marlowe's in Dunwoody. What a great time that was to sort of build the momentum towards National Signing Day coming up in February. So much fun to be with you. So much fun to be with Jeff Sintel. For all of you who came out last night, huge thanks to you for that. And for those of you who said, man, I missed you last night, but I'd love to see a Marlowe's event soon, the great news is the month of January is going to offer a lot of opportunities for you to do just that, including this next week. We're going to be back at it again at a Marlowe's Tavern, making our triumphant return to Buford. Yeah, it's been a while since we've been at the Marlowe's location there in Buford. We're going to be up there in the north part of Gwinnett County next week. It's Tuesday, January 15th from 6 to 8 p.m. Marlowe's in Buford. That's right there at the Mall of Georgia. It's 3333 Buford Drive, but it's essentially like right there connected to the Mall of Georgia. We'll be there from 6 to 8 p.m., so please come out and see us at the Marlowe's in Buford, Mall of Georgia location next Tuesday from 6 to 8 p.m. Myself and Jeff Sintel. That's going to be an incredible, incredible time. All right. Before I talk to Mike Griffith, let me give you some more context on the Jim Chaney situation as we go around the doghouse here on this Wednesday, brought to you by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. So what I told you a moment ago was that Jim Chaney's out, going to Tennessee. Tennessee is going to try to sell this as a great win for the Tennessee program, swooping in and taking away Georgia's offensive coordinator. Georgia's going to try to sell this as, hey, listen, this is no big deal for Georgia. Georgia didn't want to match the Tennessee offer. Georgia's major concern is holding on to Sam Pittman, and the fact that Georgia is going to be able to do that means losing Chaney's no big deal. The evidence as we understand it right now would certainly support Georgia's claim on that. But there's also an element in which this story is a little more complicated than even those two stark contrasts here. Because there are a lot of Georgia fans who are going to want to take Chaney's departure as an example and evidence that Kirby Smart was dissatisfied with Jim Chaney. Chaney has always been, I'm talking about going back to 2016 for sure, but even in last year of 2017 when the Georgia offense was humming along to the tune of a college football playoff appearance, Chaney has always been a lightning rod for criticism. And some Georgia fans are going to view Chaney's departure now as evidence that they were right, that Chaney is no good as an offensive coordinator, and even Kirby Smart knows it. And the fact that Chaney's not here proves all of that to be the case. But the actual circumstantial evidence may suggest that while Georgia didn't fight as hard as it needed to hold on to Chaney, at a certain point they grew tired of that process. There certainly seemed to be some evidence they at least fought a little bit hard to hold on to Chaney, suggesting that maybe Kirby wasn't quite as dissatisfied with the Georgia offense as some Georgia fans have been. Let me give you some more evidence that points to this being true. Last night, good report from Chip Towers at DawgNation.com talking to Georgia tight end Isaac Nauta. Now, Nauta's on his way out of the program now, but he's still obviously close to the situation in Athens, at least for the moment. And he said something to Chip Towers that I thought was pretty interesting last night. Let me show you the quote here from Nauta to Towers at DawgNation.com in terms of what Nauta is hearing. And he's just like the rest of us, kind of mixed up in all the rumor mill here, but presumably he's closer than some of us when it comes to stuff like this because he actually played on this team this past year. Here is Nauta's quote to Chip Towers. Nauta says, and this is an honest moment from him, he says, I don't know what to believe right now. The last I heard was he was signing an extension with Georgia after the Tennessee rumors first began. That's tight end Isaac Nauta talking to Chip Towers at DawgNation.com. So for the people who want to say that this is an example of Jim Chaney being completely on the outside with Kirby Smart looking to totally overhaul the Georgia offense, Nauta's quote would seem to dispute that. Mike Griffith's report that Georgia initially offered Chaney a raise would seem to dispute that. The fact that Chaney, according to some other reporting from Mike Griffith earlier in the week, got a contract extension last year would also seem to dispute that. Now, for the most part, that's water under the bridge that doesn't really matter. But here's why I bring that up. Because when you look at what the Georgia offense is going to be going forward, for the people who want the new look Georgia offense to be a true new look, a complete departure from what Jim Chaney has been doing, I think this circumstantial evidence suggests that's not going to happen. The fact that, while Georgia didn't want to offer Chaney $1.5 million, it apparently suggested by Nauta, reported by Griffith, at least offered him another raise here after the 2018 season. after giving him his extension a year ago would suggest that Kirby Smart was a little happier with the Georgia offense than maybe some Georgia fans are. And so that when Georgia, has a different coordinator in place in 2018, it's likely to be more of a tweak than it is a complete overhaul. I don't know how that lands with all Georgia fans, but I do think that's an important addendum to this discussion. It's DawgNation Daily here around the Doghouse, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. By now, you know what Engineered Solutions of Georgia provides. It's foundation repair, basement waterproofing, crawl space encapsulation, and they offer a lifetime of support. That's why you want to give them a call right now. It's 678-ESOG now. That number, once again, 678-ESOG now. You can have one of their qualified basement professional technicians come out to your home. You can check for a cracked foundation, a wet basement, a damp crawl space. They'll take really good care of you. They're the only foundation repair company the DawgNation would trust because they're the only one that has a full-time engineer on staff. That really matters. When you talk about the support for your house and how you kind of keep all that in place, you got to have an engineer that knows what he or she is doing, and certainly Engineered Solutions of Georgia has that. That's why we trust them. So give them a call at 678-ESOG now. We have a lot on Jim Chaney on today's program. Later on, we'll talk about how his arrival at Knoxville could impact the Vols offense, what that means for the race in the SEC East this season. We'll do that. And we'll talk about the one area in which I think that Georgia obviously needs to be better next season, and maybe the one area in which you can probably point to some issues that Kirby Smart may have had with Chaney. We'll talk about that. But for more of the facts, more of the details on exactly what went on, how much Georgia did fight to keep Chaney, and what his actual departure truly means, let's talk to Mike Griffith right now here on DawgNation Daily. And we will get Mike coming up in just a moment. Mike is getting set up and get ready to go, so we'll do that. We'll also stay on today to take a lot of your video comments here as well. So we'll cover a lot of ground on the program, and we may have a couple of minutes here to take a couple comments while we're still tracking Mike down here. It's obviously a busy time for him as he works all his sources and works the phone. Are you with me, though, on the overall takeaway on all of this? That Georgia's, statement that it didn't work that hard to keep Jim Chaney is backed up by the fact that he's going to get a huge raise, apparently from Tennessee, and that Georgia's going to be able to keep Sam Pittman. The evidence that's been entered into evidence here would certainly seem to support that. However, this idea that some Georgia fans want to believe that Kirby Smart was completely dissatisfied with Jim Chaney, that doesn't quite pass the smell test, given the thought that maybe Georgia at least offered him an extension to begin with before he ultimately took a bigger raise at Tennessee and gave him an extension last year as well. We not Mike Griffith yet. All right, we will get Mike coming up in just a couple of minutes. While we're waiting on that, I'll dive here, take a couple of your comments, and we can react to all of this before Mike is ready to join us. So, the reason why that matters when it comes to Georgia and its fans right now is I wouldn't expect the next Georgia offense to be all that different from this Georgia offense. This is still going to be a philosophy built around what Kirby Smart wants to do, which is run the ball behind a bunch of really good, dominant offensive linemen, and then throwing as a complement to all of that. This is not going to be a team that suddenly resembles what Oklahoma has done or something like that, which is not what every fan wants to hear, but it is what I believe the actual facts in this situation are. So on Facebook, a few of your comments, and then we'll get Mike Griffith coming up after that. Carl Carr says, let BA run the offense. Listen, I think we'd all fashion ourselves as play callers from time to time, but I don't know that's a job that I'd ever want to have. John Arena says, I think that sounds right. Georgia was okay with Chaney, but not happy enough to give him a big raise. Yeah, I mean, that's a big, well done, summation of all this. I think Georgia probably was kind of happy with Chaney, even though some Georgia fans were not. I think Georgia fans, for the most part, were happy with Chaney. I'm sorry, I think that Georgia, for the most part, was happy with Chaney, but not so much so to give him $1.5 million salary next season. I mean, after all, Chaney only got the $100,000 raise last year when a lot of other guys got really big raises, and you can make a case the only reason why Chaney even got that raise is to justify his presence as offensive coordinator with James Coley also getting a raise. So. This is one of those deals where the truth is probably somewhere in the middle of the two major narratives that's going to be trying to establish on the Tennessee side of this and on the Georgia side of this. Cliff Hancock says odds of Coley are looking outside. So Cliff, part of the reason why I said what I said a moment ago about what would appear to be Kirby Smart a little more satisfied with the Georgia offense than some fans would want him to be, is because I think it does lead to a scenario where James Coley is the more likely hire here. Now, listen, I was wrong about Chaney. I didn't think Chaney was leaving, so you can take this with a grain of salt as well. There's a really good chance I'm wrong about this too. But I think you're moving into Jake Fromm's junior season, most important season for him at quarterback. This is the year in which, we've all been pointing to 2019 as a big year for Georgia on the field, but it's also a big year for Fromm's development as a potential NFL quarterback as well. That seems like an odd time to completely overhaul the offensive identity, to bring someone from the outside coming in, unless you're going to do like what some NFL teams have done, where you bring in a different guy to run the same system. That has happened at the NFL level. Maybe that could happen at the college level as well. But Jake Fromm needs a big year in his junior season. Georgia needs a big year in Kirby Smart's fourth year. There's a lot of pressure on Georgia this season, and dancing with the girl that brung you, so to speak, might be the right way to go. I saw one of our commenters a moment ago said that Terrence Edwards on Twitter is supporting James Coley for the job. I haven't seen that tweet from Terrence, but that's kind of an interesting thing to hear. Khalid Winston says we need a spread offense, and I understand why people would say that, especially when you see how some of these offenses that are thought to be more spread than Georgia, they're scoring a lot of points and they're churning up a lot of yards, getting a lot of wins. But there is no free lunch in life. There's no free lunch in college football. If Georgia were to go to more of a full-time spread offense, and from time to time Georgia does things that sort of look spreadish, what it does near the ends of halves with its 2-minute offense, which, by the way, usually works. But that's certainly similar to some spread concepts. But if you did that more often than not, if you went no huddle more often than not, which a lot of Georgia fans would love to see them do, there is a trade-off to that, right? You've got really big offensive linemen that are going to get fatigued. You've got a Georgia offense that wants to run the football, and in the SEC, that may be full well a requirement. If you're in up-tempo spread, no huddle a lot of the time, then you're gonna lessen your ability to do some of those kinds of things, which ultimately in turn may also lessen your ability to be a good defensive team. What you do on offense also impacts you on defense, and Kirby Smart, a defensive-minded head coach, for better or worse, I do not believe is going to make a decision for his offense that puts his defense into a precarious situation. But we'll take a lot of your comments on this subject. For now, though, let's talk to a guy that's had some really good reporting on all of this. He's been all over the story for the last few days. It's Mike Griffith here on DawgNation Daily.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
We will say hello to Mike Griffith here. Incredible reporting from him last night. He was also the first one to break the fact that Chaney had signed a contract extension. He did that a year ago. Mike broke the story a couple of days ago. That never really made its way into the public sphere until Mike brought that to bear. So, Mike, we appreciate your reporting on this here for DawgNation.com. And let me kind of state what I've said on the show, and then I want to pick up with what you were able to learn and report last night. It seems like, based on reading what you've reported and what Chip and Jeff have also added to this, that Georgia may have tried a little bit to keep Jim Chaney. Certainly putting to bed, the thoughts that Kirby Smart was completely dissatisfied with the Georgia offense and some of the issues that Chaney may have had. But as you said, it did not go the full way, and you got a source, quote to say that this was about money for Chaney, that at a certain point, Georgia got to an area in which it was just no longer comfortable matching what Tennessee was bringing to the table. Am I kind of stating this correctly in your opinion in terms of how this went down with ultimately how Jim Chaney ends up at Tennessee?
Yeah, there's a lot of dynamics to it, Brandon. Anytime you've got a staff, you've got to make sure that, that there's staff harmony. I mean, obviously we know that working, as closely as we work together on a lot of the stories that we do and the games that we cover. And, it's up to the manager to make sure that everybody's on in a good place from a staff harmony standpoint. And, you can't pay Jim Chaney $1.5 million or $1.7 million or whatever that number's going to end up. I'm not sure, where that negotiation ended, and pay some defensive assistants $320,000. I mean, that's not going to happen in a program like Georgia. You've got to have some balance and some harmony, and if you're going to raise Jim Chaney to 1.7, does that mean you raise Coley to 1.7, Del McGee to 1.7, and Sam Pittman? You can't do that. Everybody can't be, a $1.7 or $1.5 million guy. And, you look at, let's be honest about the Jim Chaney situation this year, and let's look at the end result. And, while I think Jim is a good coach, and I think he's what Tennessee needs right now. He's a coordinator that Jeremy Pruitt will respect, and he'll have run a similar offense to what Kirby's doing. The bottom line is that Georgia had some problems this year. There were some players that second-guessed Jim Chaney's play calling in short yardage situations. When I was at the Sugar Bowl, that came out. I didn't think that in and of itself was the story because, players are kind of always talking. But, in hindsight, looking back, that was a smoking gun. The short yardage issues they had, the Justin Fields situation, certainly. Jim Chaney said at the Sugar Bowl he thought they did right, and he said it was his job to figure out the best way to use Justin Fields. And, in hindsight, obviously Justin Fields and his family didn't feel like they were used properly. Jim Chaney bears some responsibility for that. Isaac Nada goes pro. You can't put that on Jim Chaney, but Luke Ford transfers. Part of Jim Chaney's job is to be a mentor. And, in addition to recruit these kids, keep these kids. And so if you just look at the results, it wasn't ideal. It wasn't the kind of results that would justify doubling Jim Chaney's salary. So I think Kirby was responsible, and Georgia was responsible. Match an initial offer, okay, 1.2, whatever. But you start getting into that stratosphere of 1.5, 1.7. Did Jim Chaney do the type of job that warranted him being the highest-paid offensive coordinator in the nation? No, he didn't.
So you gave us a lot to chew on right there. So let me try to break up all these things into individual parts. I want to talk to you more about what you said about Justin Fields. I want to talk to you more about Kirby's feelings on Chaney. That's all really interesting. But let me go also back to the first sentence that you spoke when you initially began that answer. You talked about staff harmony, which is a really interesting phrase to use. Now, you reference it in relationship to the salaries that all the various coaches are making. But there's also the scuttlebutt out there that Chaney and Coley didn't see eye to eye on issues. Is that believable for you, even if you can't outright confirm the suggestion that Chaney and Coley had I guess had a difficult working relationship? Does it seem believable to you that somehow that Chaney felt threatened by Coley's ascendancy on the Georgia staff?
I don't know that I believe Jim Chaney felt threatened by anybody. But do I believe that there was, some frustration? Absolutely. This was a frustrating season for Georgia. Let's face it. This is a team that got off to an unexpectedly great start and reaching number 2 in the country, and then, at LSU nothing worked, and it was everybody's fault. Let's be clear about that. That was as much Kirby Smart. It was Mel Tucker. It was everybody. LSU was a complete failure, a complete program loss. Put it on Jake Fromm, put it on, defense, put it on everybody. That, I don't think so. But listen, when I saw Chaney at halftime of the Sugar Bowl jetting through that tunnel on his way back up to the press box in a golf cart, the look on his face was, it was unbelievable. The season ended in a fantastically frustrating way. With Justin Fields leaving, people have told me that Jim Chaney was just absolutely irate with that. A lot of the language that he used on the practice field was being used in reference to Justin Fields. He was very angry about the whole way that thing shook down. I think that he probably took some accountability for that. Again, I'm not. It's not a blame game thing here. It didn't work out for Justin. Kirby Smart's the head coach. But, Jim Chaney had a big hand in how Justin Fields was used. And it did not work. They did not keep Justin Fields. At the end of the day, the plan didn't work. And, Kirby had a big hand in the plan, but so did Jim Chaney. At the end of the day, the Georgia offense didn't get the job done against Alabama in the second half. Again, at the end of the day, Coley was promoted to quarterback's coach, and Jim Chaney was working with the tight end. There's a lot there, Brandon, to look at. And, do I think Kirby wanted Jim gone? Not necessarily, no. But there's only so far you can go, before other guys go, wait a minute. If Jim Chaney's making 1.7, why not me?
So let's talk about the Fields part of this for a moment, because I obviously talk about this kind of stuff every single day. And I think it's universally agreed upon that the way that Georgia used Fields this season was incorrect. It's better not to have him on the roster at all if he's only going to be used sporadically the way that he was. It'd be better to have him on the roster and not play him even than the way that he was used. But, Mike, honesty compels me to admit that at the time, me speaking to this microphone, commenters commenting, this was never a deal of why is Jim Chaney using him this way. This was a deal of why is Kirby Smart using him this way. Even though Kirby Smart was not the offensive coordinator, this was always thought to be Kirby Smart's plan or lack of plan for Justin Fields and not Jim Chaney overriding, whatever Smart's vision was. I think for some people, me included, it's going to seem a little too convenient to lay the blame for what went wrong with Justin Fields on the guy who's on his way out the door right now. It may be true, but that's an awful tidy storyline for Georgia to say, Jim Chaney was here, he didn't use Fields correctly, and so now he's gone. Isn't the Fields debacle Kirby Smart's mess to clean up more so than Jim Chaney's?
Well, ultimately, everything falls on the head coach, Brandon. Everything, where they say that stuff rolls uphill, right? Ultimately, the boss is always responsible, but obviously we weren't in those closed-door meetings between Jim Chaney and Kirby Smart for how Justin Fields was going to be used. We weren't there when promises were made, with the family or what if there were promises. We don't know the inner workings, but we do know that Jim Chaney was the play caller, and we do know what Jim Chaney told us in New Orleans, that it was his job, to find ways to use players to the best of their ability. He's the offensive coordinator. He is the offensive expert. I wouldn't go as far as to say he's the head coach of offense because I do think that Kirby had a framework in place for Jim. I don't think it was a free rein to just do whatever you want. But listen, Jim Chaney's been doing this long enough that he understands complementary football. He understands how the offense works with the defense and the defense works with the offense. In the end, I don't think Jim Chaney is leaving because of any of these particulars. I do think these particulars are why Georgia didn't feel the need to up his ante and match the Tennessee offer. We're not talking about Georgia firing Jim Chaney or Kirby Smart being completely dissatisfied with Jim Chaney. We're talking about why didn't Georgia match the offer when it got that high from Tennessee. And the answer was, in some of these particulars, I believe.
So let me follow up on the Chaney part of this here for a moment, then, and the Kirby Smart relationship. So he gets a raise and extension last year. You reported that. You're reporting modest raise, but additional years added onto the contract, which is not an insignificant amount of money. That's probably the most important part of that. You're right, small raise, but more years. And Georgia was, according to your reporting, also willing to give him a raise before ultimately declining on the full match that Tennessee was offering. So how dissatisfied can we really say Kirby Smart was if he was willing to give him a raise a year after having just given him another contract extension? What would your response be to that question?
Yeah, no, to your point, I think we get back to the harmony there. And, it's interesting on the extension, Brandon. I want to say a word about that. I've seen the paperwork that reflects that Jim didn't get an extension. So I don't blame any of the Georgia reporters, anybody else that's reported that. That's what USA Today has in hand right now. I've seen the paperwork. I made a call to the athletic department. The athletic department told me verbally that this is a contract that goes through June of 2021. Athletic department spokesperson has told multiple people that. We've yet to see that paperwork. So another curious part of this, and now it's very much a side note, but Georgia's new laws with the FOIA and the information access are so murky that this extension took place and nobody knew it. And to me, that's a problem, and I don't understand that. And it's a story for another day. But that's not good for anybody if there's not going to be that level of transparency. I'm not sure why Georgia went backwards with that state law as far as Freedom of Information Act and the public's right to have public knowledge and information in a reasonable time frame. I think now it's 90 days. At Tennessee, it's 24 hours. Tennessee's going to stay ahead on the story because they have the Sunshine Law factor, the FOIA that is much more favorable where they can get information and request. In fact, I filed Information Acts in Tennessee because you're going to get information out of there much faster than Georgia because of these new state laws that came in about the same time Kirby did. So that's an interesting side note to this, is how that was sort of murky and curious, that there's been this large assumption that Jim Chaney's contract expired. And to this point, the only paperwork produced indicates that. My report came directly from a high-ranking university spokesperson that told me that the contract goes through June of 2021, and I have put in a request for that information. So I just want to clarify that part of the story and where that's at. Getting back to the Kirby part, Brandon, honestly, I think there's a lot of room for speculation right now. All we can do is kind of put the pieces out there. So when I bring this information out about the players that second-guessed Jim's play calling at the Sugar Bowl, when I bring the information out there, about the dynamics of the staff salary, these are all pieces to the puzzle. But ultimately, Kirby Smart and Jim Chaney are the only two men that know exactly what happened. We can come up with all these different parts of the story that we know and put them together, but this picture is not going to be completely clear until Kirby speaks, and even then, I don't think Kirby's going to say one bad word about Jim Chaney. I don't think anybody is. I think he was very much respected and well-liked at Georgia. Things weren't perfect, for sure, but I think that Georgia loses a very good coach. But I also think that Kirby Smart's very confident that the Georgia football program can move on and have some success without Jim Chaney.
Couple quick issues before we let you go, Mike. Jeff Sintel's also reported to DawgNation that Sam Pittman is now expected to return. And for most Georgia fans, as you're full aware, this is the bigger issue for them anyway. Chaney's ultimate value at Georgia and initial value at Georgia was because that was a guy that Sam Pittman wanted to work with. This, for me, is an offense built around Pittman more so than built around Jim Chaney to begin with. So if Georgia wants to, act as if this is all under control and this is a situation well taken care of, it's certainly easier to make that claim with Pittman returning, right?
Well, I was told that the priority was, Pittman, McGee, and Coley. When all this went down, as long as, 2 nights ago, I think Kirby felt like Jim was going to stay. I don't think that they thought that Jim was going to go to Tennessee. That's a very challenging situation, and now it's a from a standpoint of financials, that's Jim's main drive. I mean, he is nearing retirement. He does have an affinity for Tennessee, and there's some connections and some ties there. There may even be some retirement benefits there that may be a little more favorable. I haven't been able to dig in deep enough to confirm all that, but that's some of the things that I've heard. So it's a financial decision for Jim. Look, nobody's stupid here. All right, Tennessee's not going to win as many football games as Georgia next year. Jim Chaney can only do so much with Jarrett Garantano. He's not Jake Fromm. That program is in rebuilding. The pressure on Jim Chaney is going to be immense. It's not a better job than Georgia, but it does pay significantly more. And I do think there was some frustrations in that Georgia offensive meeting room this year. Certainly the close call last year, and with what happened this year, between the second half of the SEC championship game, the short yardage struggles, and Justin Fields, I think there was a lot of pressure on Jim Chaney here. And certainly we've seen from the fans' reactions that as much good as he did, he was largely the scapegoat these past 2 seasons.
All right,
right or wrong.
Last thing for you before we let you go, would you characterize James Coley, who you mentioned a moment ago, as the favorite to become Chaney's replacement?
I was actually on the phone right before you called, Brandon. I apologize. That's why I wasn't able to take those first couple calls from Connor there. From what I'm understanding, Kirby is considering an outside person. I don't know if that means the play caller or the coordinator. I don't know if that means that who's the A and who's the B with Coley. Coley's in fact, I'm working on that story right now. So I would say that is in flux. It's, I don't know what the title's going to be, if it'll be another co-coordinator type of situation. I don't know if Coley's going to be ready for the play calling, because I've been told that Kirby is talking to outside people about that position. But is it a co-position? Is it the head position? That I don't know. I don't even know if that's been determined. So I think that's a very fluid situation right now. But I would certainly say Coley would be considered for that.
Well, Mike, I will tell you this. You're a veteran reporter. You've been around the block a few times here, and it's great to have your resources, your ability to make contact with the newsmakers and provide that information for us here at DawgNation.com. So we really appreciate that. We will look forward to reading everything else you got to write on this subject in the days ahead at DawgNation.com. It's incredibly generous for you to spend some time with us here today on DawgNation Daily, and we will look forward to speaking to you soon.
Thanks, Brandon. Great report by Jeff Sentell getting the story everybody was chasing on Sam Pittman. So the team is really getting after it. Enjoy the show.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
So interesting from Mike there at the end, saying that his sources are telling him that Georgia is at least talking to outside names beyond just the inside, promoted candidate of James Coley. Now, as Mike alluded to, that could mean a number of things. It could mean an outside name to step in as tight ends coach in replacement of the position role that Chaney filled, or it could mean, co-offensive coordinator, an actual offensive coordinator with Coley not getting a promotion. There are a number of things that could mean in terms of what an outside coach could do for Georgia. It could be above Coley on the food chain or below Coley on the food chain. But interesting there from Mike that he's already hearing from sources that Kirby is talking to outside guys here in terms of potentially filling that role. And, of course, DawgNation will be all over that as more information comes available. I've got more on Chaney myself. And the other thing I'm going to finish up with today, you heard Mike talk a lot about short yardage situations. That may be the one area in which we do have some evidence that Kirby Smart was dissatisfied with Jim Chaney. And everything else is sort of circumstantial and guessing. But this may be the one example in which we can feel with some confidence that we know that Kirby Smart wasn't loving everything about that. I'll give you some numbers to back it up, and I'll give you some evidence for that coming up in just a moment. Before that, though, let me tell you about a great offer at Kroger. Starting today, you can earn 3 times the fuel points on hundreds of items at your local Atlanta Kroger, including all bakery cookies, all floral items, and all pet items. That is now through January 22nd. So visit your local Atlanta store today to start earning your fuel points. You need this stuff anyway, especially with Valentine's Day coming up, with the floral stuff and everything else. So buy that stuff at your local Kroger and earn the fuel points. How about that? 3 times the fuel points right now. That is a great deal. All right. One of the things for me that can be a little bit maddening about offensive coordinator talk is that A, no one seems to agree on anything, and B, every offensive coordinator is, to a certain degree, disliked or distrusted by either the fans on the scene or the media that covers him. So now you got Jim Chaney moving on to Tennessee, and how this story is going to be covered from the Knoxville perspective, I think it's going to be really interesting because, as you know, Georgia's going to be playing Chaney each and every year. So is this a good hire or a bad hire for Tennessee? Well, apparently it sort of depends on who you ask on this. Let me show you a tweet from Dan Wolken, USA Today. Dan lives in Georgia, so he's at a lot of Georgia games. About how Tennessee fans should feel about Chaney. Wolken tweets out, Jim Chaney is fine. He's fine. He's perfect if you want your offense to be uncreative and yet maddening. That's Dan Wolken from USA Today. A lot of Georgia fans say, that's exactly right. That is exactly what Jim Chaney is. He's maddening. He's uncreative. It's predictable play calling. It's also the same thing that Georgia fans said about Mike Bobo and probably, every fan base says about, virtually every offensive coordinator. I mean, you have a hard time finding any coordinator who has universal approval among his fan base. The flip side of that, though, is you hear Wolken saying that. Jimmy Hyams, the guy we quoted from here on DawgNation Daily a couple days ago, longtime voice around Tennessee, has a decidedly different take on Jim Chaney. Once again, to the Twitter sphere we go here for Jimmy Hyams, who says, 2 coaches with SEC ties told me that Chaney is the best offensive coordinator and best play caller in the SEC. Chaney will get a 3-year deal, about $4.5 million, and Hyams says he has got a $500,000 buyout at Georgia. But the bigger issue here is the fact that Jimmy Hyams says, I had 2 people that tell me, coaches with SEC ties, he's the best play caller in the SEC. What is the real truth? Like a lot of things, probably somewhere in the middle. I think overall, though, what the story of Chaney to Tennessee really means is that Jeremy Pruitt, who has always felt like a little bit of a firebrand, a little bit of a hothead, sometimes the brightest fires, the hottest fires burn out the quickest. I think there was some wait and see about Jeremy Pruitt when he first gets the Tennessee job. Will he eventually burn out? Is this inexperienced, never before been a head coach guy? Can he handle the demeanor necessarily to become a head coach? With a lot of these things, it's who you hire as an offensive coordinator that determines your job security. Will Muschamp never found his offensive coordinator at Florida, and he was out of the job within 3 years. Kirby Smart found the stability at Georgia largely because of what Jim Chaney and the offense provided to UGA, especially in the SEC championship season of 2017. The one thing that I think that Chaney provides for Tennessee, probably not a huge boost in 2019 necessarily, because as Mike Griffith pointed out a moment ago, I still don't think Tennessee's all that talented. But the likelihood that Pruitt's still employed in 2020, in 2021, in 2022, the fact that he gets a full 5 years to kind of really establish himself at Tennessee and then see where this program's going, I think Chaney makes that a lot more plausible. I think that Tennessee as a program is just going to have a lot more professional face with a more competent offensive coordinator. And, by the way, the other thing that will be very interesting here, Chaney probably ran the ball and committed himself to running the ball at Tennessee more than he did, at Georgia more than he did really any other program in any of his career stops up to this point. At Tennessee in the future, is it a very different looking Jim Chaney in terms of the kinds of plays that he prefers calling? My guess is you will see that given the personnel in place there in Knoxville. And that could also be a pretty interesting contrast as well. We will make that your SEC through. And here on DawgNation Daily, I want to talk a little bit more about one of the things that Mike Griffith brought up, which is, the issues that Georgia had in short yardage offense this season. You remember the goal line stand that Florida was able to have against Georgia in a game that ultimately Georgia still won in blowout fashion, but what was it, 6 or 7 plays right down near the goal line? Georgia could not score. The following week against Kentucky, Georgia also has some other goal line issues, which became sort of the video heard around the world. If you're watching on video, we'll show this to you. If you're listening, you've probably seen this before. It's the deal where Kirby Smart gets so upset in talking to his headset that he eventually puts his, cups his hands over the ears and just really screams into that headset after another goal line failure. I mean, for a lot of people, they're going to look at that piece of video, knowing when it happened, after another goal line issue, and knowing what was going on with Georgia, and say, that right there proves that Kirby Smart was dissatisfied with Chaney, at least in that regard, when it came to the goal line offense. Now, I would say, first of all, be careful reading too much into body language on the sideline. Football's an intense sport. Coaches have a way of coaching in an intense fashion. Sometimes the body language can be misleading, but it's probably not too much of a stretch to say Kirby Smart would probably look at that, short yardage, red zone goal line offense and say that it could have been better. I thought that Bill Conley, leading in the SEC championship game at Football Study Hall, had some interesting stats to kind of back some of this up as well. The one area in which Georgia does need to improve with a new offensive coordinator, the one issue in which Jim Chaney was clearly deficient. If you look at how Georgia kind of got worse as it got close to the goal line, Conley wrote that by the time that Georgia got inside the opponent's 3-yard line this past season, this is going into the SEC championship, that Georgia's success rate, meaning the percentage of yards it got on a given play, was just 129th in the country. Conley wrote at Football Study Hall, as the goal line nears, UGA changes from one of the country's best offenses to one of the worst. So that's some actual data to back up what we saw Kirby Smart on the sideline at Kentucky be upset about. That as Georgia got closer to the goal line, all of a sudden its offensive efficiency, which was top 3, top 4, top 5, depending on which one of these metrics you favor, by the time you got down near the goal line, Georgia became 129th in the country in success rate. Conley in that same piece wrote that one of the ways in which, goal line success typically occurs is you've got to throw the ball at the goal line. And there was a belief among many Georgia fans that Jim Chaney was just too conservative there in that regard. So if you want to sort of attach a criticism to Chaney that probably sticks, what Georgia did at the goal line, especially against Florida and against Kentucky, that probably, kind of sticks to that there. But it's also worth pointing out those were also blowout victories for Georgia. Auburn was right there in that same mix, and that was also an easy win for UGA. Because the overall bottom line is while the goal line offense may not have been great, the rest of the plays from Jim Chaney's perspective seemed to be working pretty well. In fact, I was going to play this audio early in the show and I forgot to. Can we hear Jim Chaney, his defense of his Georgia offense from the critics? This is what Chaney said leading into the Sugar Bowl on that.
I feel good about it. You know, as a coach nowadays, when you're clicking around that 40-point-a-game mark, you feel like you've done okay. You're scoring points. When you sit in this chair, you're never happy. You know, we're looking for that perfect game and perfection at all times. Are we content with what we got done? In some ball games. Other games we didn't play particularly well. But I think we did throw the ball a little bit better than we have in the years past, and I do believe that'll continue to grow and continue to develop. And I've talked to you guys a lot about familiarity of offense, and now Jake just ran through his second year in the system, and that shows. That shows. You ask about Jeremiah, third year in the program. You know, those first 2 years, as we're playing with a bunch of young kids, except for the boys that took off for the draft. And, you know, I think I'm most proud of those kids that left for the draft and the quality individuals they are. The young kids stepped back up, and we were able to maintain and continue to achieve some points that we needed to win a few ball games.
So interesting stuff from Jim Chaney on that. You know, the familiarity of the offense, that's a phrase that he uses. And I think that one way or another, whether it's promoting James Coley or a combination of hires that maintain some of the same stuff in place, one way or another, I do think Georgia's going to look to maintain that familiarity with the offense. I think it wants Jake Fromm to be comfortable going into its third season next year, wants more development from guys like J.J. Holloman, and wants to continue to have success around what the nucleus of this Georgia offense has been, which is Sam Pittman's offensive line. Good news that Pittman is returning, and it's certainly a great opportunity for the guys that he's brought into the program to help lead this program to better heights there in 2019. It's going to be a really interesting story. It's going to intensify the Georgia-Tennessee rivalry because, as we've said a million times on today's show, Vols are going to have their side of the story, Georgia's going to have its side of the story, and we'll see where this goes. I will remind you, speaking of SEC East rivals, 802 days since Florida's beaten Georgia. It's our Gator Hater Updater. And by the way, Georgia basketball against Vanderbilt tonight. We'll see you tomorrow right here on DawgNation Daily. And on video, your chance to react to stuff from today's show. Anything you want to say on the Coley part of this, I should say the Chaney part of this, anything you want to do on that? We can talk a lot about that and kind of get some of your thoughts on this. Robert Darrell Sykes, is it too late for Fields to change his mind? I don't think Fields went to Ohio State because of Jim Chaney. I just don't. I think that is too convenient of a narrative. I do. And if somebody can provide, some really good, sourcing and reporting on that all of the Fields issues were all Jim Chaney and Kirby Smart somehow wanted something different for Fields and decided to, bow to the whims of his offensive coordinator, then I'll change my tone on this. But I can't lay the Fields debacle completely at Chaney's ample feet. I can't do that. Galen Jacobs says that Coley would be far from a sexy hire. That's kind of why I pointed out on today's show some of the efforts that we seem to be able to verify that Kirby Smart went to maintain the continuity with Jim Chaney, the familiarity with the offense. I don't think that Kirby Smart's necessarily looking for a sexy hire here. And I would also caution to be careful about, Coley may not be a sexy, to use Galen's phrase, sexy hire or sexy promotion. There are plenty of programs who'd be dancing in the streets if they could get James Coley as a part of their program. So when it comes to Coley, a fast riser in this business, this may be an example of use him or lose him. And I would much rather use him than lose him. Ken Feinberg says Coley was part of the Fields' decision too. Coley was quarterback's coach, but, listen, it's Kirby Smart who stood there at that podium after the whatever game and said, the plan for Justin Fields is there is no plan. So, if anybody has to take the brunt of the heat, and obviously with good reason, we like Kirby Smart around here. But if anyone's going to take the brunt of the heat for why the Fields thing was a debacle, and it was a debacle, it's an embarrassment for the program to have something like that, flame out as quickly as it did. I gotta say, Kirby, what did you do, and what could you have done differently? Not what did Jim Chaney do or what could Chaney have done differently, because ultimately I think the offense next season, no matter who's the one calling plays, for me it ultimately doesn't really matter all that much. The offense is going to still look, for the most part, pretty similar to what it did this year. I'm of the belief that this offense is Kirby's vision for the program, even if he's not the one with the play card actually calling the play. So the Fields thing, I don't think you can put that in Jim Chaney's suitcase as he heads out to Knoxville. Justin Roberts says we've got to get the passing game going. Jake needs a 300 yards a game at least. getting the passing game going more in 2019 will be definitely a part of what the next offensive coordinator tries to do, whether it's an in-house name or an outside hire. When you talk about, issues facing Georgia here, this is not just, Fields' transfer and Georgia's goal line, ineptitude. This is also a situation where the top player in the state of Georgia, 5-star wide receiver, left the state to go to Oklahoma and was very open along the way about his dissatisfaction with the Georgia offense being a reason why he was considering other schools. Y'all saw what happened when Derek Brown and Aubrey Solomon, chose other schools. You saw what happened to the Georgia coaching staff after that. So when you talk about crises, that's the right word, the plural version of crisis. When you talk about, crises that Georgia has dealt with, not getting Hazelwood is going to be in that conversation as well, because the Georgia offense, as currently constituted, would look a whole lot different with a truly game-breaking, wide receiver that can blow a top off the defense. Maybe a Dominic Blaylock, becomes that guy. But not getting Hazelwood has to factor into some of this kind of stuff as well. But once again, is that Jim Chaney calling the kinds of plays that he wanted to call, or Kirby Smart's vision for a program that included, an offense that was more conservative than not? I think that's all fair to ask. Michael Weir says, checking in from D.C. Michael, first of all, thanks for that. He says, what does this mean for Sam Pittman? DawgNation has reported that Pittman is returning for the 2019 season, so you can feel pretty good about that. Somebody said, Justin Roberts says, B.A. Hazelwood left because he didn't want to block. Hazelwood's been pretty clear about this. You can go back and look at his high school film. There are plenty of examples of him blocking in high school. Hazelwood, and I don't want to do this whole thing on Hazelwood because I know some of you are tired of it. Hazelwood's not afraid of blocking. He just wanted to be an offense that he knew, could use him, and he didn't feel 100% confident about that. I don't put all the blame for that on Jim Chaney either, but when you talk about the sort of, mess that the Georgia offense had to clean up, that's a part of this here too. Don Williams also talking about how no matter who the next offensive coordinator is, there's going to be criticism. I will admit that at times it's a little bit hard for me not to be a little cynical about that because, I've done jobs like this for a long time, and the easiest thing to do is to sort of criticize the play calling after a game doesn't go well. You can see that on message boards. You can see that in comment sections. The old school radio call-in show, back in the old days when that was a big thing. People just, that they like criticizing play calling. It seems really easy to do. Every play call that doesn't work, in hindsight, seems unimaginative. Every play call that doesn't work, in hindsight, seems too predictable. I would say that there's a little bit of a mirage in place about what people have decided is unimaginative, predictable play calling. Somehow every play in hindsight that doesn't work seems obvious that it shouldn't have worked, and I don't know that kind of stuff is quite as obvious looking towards a play as opposed to looking after it. Barry Watkins says, what about Major Applewhite for offensive coordinator? There's an obvious tie-in there. Applewhite worked with Kirby Smart at Alabama at one point in time. He was an offensive coordinator at a system that's at least similar to what Georgia's doing right now. Former head coach at Houston. Got blown out at Houston in pretty ugly fashion this season. There is a pretty big, substantial rumor out there that Applewhite's about to become offensive coordinator at Miami, working for Manny Diaz. I don't think that's official. I don't think that's final, but that's one of those things that's been strongly reported to be going down, that Applewhite's going to Miami. I'm guessing you'd rather be the Georgia offensive coordinator right now than the Miami offensive coordinator right now. I'm guessing on that. Somebody did share with me that Applewhite followed Georgia football on Twitter. I don't know what you make of that, but it looks like Applewhite's going to Miami. Connor Riley?
Yeah, interesting thing just to bring up with Applewhite. We mentioned, working with Kirby Smart way back in 2007. Applewhite and Diaz were both on the Texas staff as offensive and defensive coordinators in 2011 to 2013. So 3 years track record. There's reason to believe that he's got a tighter relationship with Diaz there. And listen, when you're a guy like Diaz who's never been a head coach before, right? He's about to get his head coaching debut at Temple. You need a proven offensive mind. And Major Applewhite's just been around the block now a few times, so this could be a case where Miami really needs him. They may throw a lot of money at him in that regard.
Let me get some YouTube. Dennis Wilson says it's official that Applewhite's going to Miami. I don't know. I haven't seen it being officially announced yet, but certainly seems like it's heading that direction. Cliff Payne says Coley's one heck of a recruiter in the South Florida area. That's a fact. Dogs have to find a way to keep him. Cliff, I agree. I think that and Mike mentioned this. We've talked about this a million times on our show too. The coaches that Georgia can't afford to lose are not really coordinators. It's guys like Coley. It's guys like Pittman. It's guys like Dell McGee. Now, McGee and Coley will be head coaches somewhere eventually, so you can't keep them forever. I don't know that Pittman has any aspirations towards being a head coach. I think he enjoys the life that he has. If I'm guessing, that's what I would guess anyway. But those are the guys you got to keep, which means you got to keep giving them raises and keep giving them promotions, new titles, whatever, as a way of keeping them happy, because the Georgia machine that has been built here has been built on their backs, because, Coley's recruited both sides of the ball. Dell McGee has impacted players other than just running back. Pittman recruits the offensive lineman, but skill position players want to play in programs that have really good offensive linemen. That's your offensive nucleus. And when you got McGee bringing in the elite backs, Pittman bringing the elite offensive lineman, Coley, working his magic here, then the play caller does become a little bit of an afterthought. I mean, I thought that Jeremy Pruitt had some interesting words to say about this a few weeks ago, where he talked about in some cases offensive coordinators can be overrated. We all fixate on play calling, but I do truly believe that the thing that determines the success of a program more often than not is the amount of talent you have on the roster for the offensive coordinator to work with. And the presence of these position coaches what allows Georgia to maintain that. Now, there are specific issues. We talked about the goal line stuff a minute ago where maybe individual play calls could have been better. The LSU game, it certainly seemed like Chaney got out-coached that day by Dave Aranda. That certainly seems to be true. But overall, it's the the Jimmies and Joes you get to work with that matter probably more than the X's and O's. Dapper Dan says on the subject of Jim Chaney, I mean, if he was the quarterback whisperer, which is kind of one of those, media narratives about Chaney, why don't we change the responsibilities of Chaney from quarterbacks coach to tight ends coach? It seems like a demotion. I hate to be so cynical about this, but I think sometimes fans read too much into the position coaches that Georgia coaches occupy. Y'all, these guys are here to recruit. I mean, they just are. Coley was quarterback's coach this year. Jim Chaney would have been technically quarterback's coach the year before. I don't know what special techniques they're providing. I mean, I'm a big believer that, Chaney worked with Drew Brees, but Chaney didn't make Drew Brees. Drew Brees was Drew Brees. Chaney was lucky to have coached him. Brees wasn't lucky to have been coached by Chaney. I just 100% feel that way. I don't mean to completely minimize the value of position coaching, but an average coach coaching a great talent is going to get a lot more success than a great coach coaching an average talent. That's just all there is to it.
Yeah, just to sort of bring up a similar point. Chaney also coached Nathan Peterman, another NFL great.
Sure, NFL great.
Someone.
Yeah.
So, if you want to lump them into the same narrative together, I mean, I don't know how much Chaney actually did to help Mr. Peterman.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think Chaney's value at Georgia was he's a competent offensive mind. There's only a small number of people who can actually call plays at the SEC level, and Chaney was one of them. Jimmy Hyams going to say he's the best play caller in the history of football. Dan Wolken's going to say he's no better than average. Honestly, I don't know. I think your mileage may vary from year to year, program to program. A lot of these guys can look quite different. But Georgia's issue is talent. It's got enough talent right now to compete for a national championship. If it had a little more talent, it'd probably break through and win the national championship. That's my issue. Pick from any number of people who are capable of calling plays. Honestly, I don't know there'd been a huge difference in Jim Chaney and Jay Johnson. You could have just, flipped seats. I'm not so sure the results are necessarily all that different. I'm not that fixated on who the play caller actually is. If I could have brought in a guy like Dan Enos, who I do think did a pretty good job at Arkansas, the statistics kind of back that up, I would have been excited about that. It looks like he's going to be Alabama's offensive coordinator. I think that's probably a pretty good promotion for that program. But ultimately, do I feel confident he's that much better than Chaney? No, I don't. I think there's a lot of people, or certainly a group of people, who could potentially be Georgia play callers, and Georgia just needs to find the one that Sam Pittman wants to work with. I mean, and for me, when it comes to the Georgia offense, it's really kind of as simple as that. Steve Vane says, let's not exaggerate what Chaim said. He got a quote from these SEC coaches that he was the best play caller in the SEC. That's pretty much what I said. And listen, I don't think Chaney's a bad offensive coordinator. I don't. But I do think when it comes to this kind of stuff, you're going to have some people oversell and some people undersell, and the truth's going to be kind of somewhere in the middle.
We talk a lot about in past couple of shows about how the NFL, they want these dynamic play callers. The reality is in college football, it's the same way as well. If you're a great offensive coordinator, you're not going to stay an offensive coordinator for long. So it's like, congrats on being the tallest short person. Yeah,
because, I mean, we're in a day and age now where, like, there are children who are head coach in the NFL now. I mean, Cliff Kingsbury is incredibly young. Sean McVay is incredibly young, and these guys are head coach in the NFL. As you said, these what we think of as offensive coordinator types, they just don't last in that role very long. They roll right through. And
so do you consider yourself to be incredibly young?
41.
I mean, Cliff Kingsbury turns 40 in 2 months.
I guess he just looks so much better than I do.
He does, yeah.
That's the problem. It's like, listen, I'd give anything if this 40 looked the same as that 40. I'd give anything. I don't think that Cliff Kingsbury would have any problem whatsoever. Taking his shirt off in front of this camera right here. There ain't no chance I'd do that. So maybe this is an issue where the Kingsbury 40 and the BA 40 are just two very different versions of 4 decades. James Holcomb says Brian McClendon should be an option. So here's a perfect example of this. There are plenty of South Carolina fans who don't like McClendon. So look, I'd be fine with McClendon. McClendon, is making a good bit of money in South Carolina now. As long as Sam Pittman wants to work with them, I'd be fine. Sam Pittman is the alpha when it comes to the Georgia offensive coaches, and everybody else who falls in line ought to fall in line around him. And I think his salary is ultimately going to be be commensurate with that.
For all the Brian McClendon news, I know, that offense scored 35 points against Clemson. Do you know how many points they scored in their last game against a Virginia team that went 7-5 in the regular season?
Be that many right there.
That would be a big zero.
They did not crack the egg.
I asked you this question last night also. Over under 2.5 Georgia assistant coaches next year, coordinators and position coaches included. Over under 2.5 making more than $1 million.
So I think that Pittman's going to make more than $1 million. I think Coley's going to make more than $1 million. Do you have to give the defensive coordinator now $1 million just to sort of, as Mike said, you got to have a somewhat level, degree of parity when it comes to your coaching salaries. Otherwise, people start getting a little disgruntled behind the scenes. Do you think, assuming it's an in-house promotion like a guy like Dan Lanning, do you have to pay Lanning $1 million just to kind of keep him somewhat at parity with the offensive side of the ball?
I don't think so. Not this year, but maybe, if things go well with Lanning, a year from now.
So
you're paying him $1 million.
Here's one of my theories about college football. I have a few really steadfast theories, and one of my theories is that programs like Georgia need to really exploit areas in which the NCAA does not put a cap or a limit. You can only have 85 players at one time. There is nothing you can do about that. You cannot skirt that rule. You cannot get around that rule. That is a cap. That is a hard rule. You can sort of fudge your year-to-year numbers, but you can't fudge your overall 85 number. That's a cap put on by the NCAA. So the smart programs are always going to exploit areas in which the NCAA or the SEC, doesn't have some sort of limit. That's why you see programs like Georgia bring in analysts. That's just an area where Georgia can exploit. You can have guys working as paid football coaches because there's not a lot of limitations on that. Another area in which there aren't a lot of limitations that Georgia ought to exploit is when it comes to coaches. I think that Georgia ought to feel free to pay its coaches whatever it wants. There is no unseemly amount for me. If Georgia really wanted Jim Chaney, I wouldn't have a problem with them paying him $1.5 million. They just didn't think he was worth that much money, which I'm fine with. But paying Sam Pittman that much, there's no reason why Georgia shouldn't. Paying Dell McGee that much so he doesn't go take like the Rice job or the Troy job or one of these low-level Division I jobs as a head coach, at least discourage that. No reason why they shouldn't. The NCAA does not put a cap. You can only have 10 coaches, but you can pay them $1 billion if you want to. So therefore, I believe that Georgia needs to exploit the rules that are available to be exploited, and that is one of those examples of that. For instance, if you gave me a choice as like king of Georgia football to spend money on coaches or spend money on a building, I'd much rather have better coaches than nicer offices for those coaches. Because when you talk about a football facility like which Clemson has, Alabama has, presumably Georgia wants, a football facility is nicer offices. I mean, that's what it really is. It's just a better
and a slide,
and a slide or a putt-putt course. Like, if you want to talk about how you draw a line from success in the football field, I don't know how a better building gives you a better team. But giving raises to guys like Dell McGee, James Coley, and Sam Pittman so they don't leave, that absolutely is a bottom-line impact on your wins and losses.
Yeah. Well, one thing we were talking about, Lanning potentially getting a big bump in pay. Do you know how much money Dan Lanning made last year?
Like $350 or something like that?
$325,000. That's as much. Rob Sale, the former failed Georgia offensive line coach, who is now, I believe, the offensive coordinator at Louisiana Lafayette, made $325,000. So, with him, he'll get a huge raise, and I don't think you need to bump him up to $1 million because he'll be happy that he's just not making $325,000 anymore.
Yeah, I mean, Georgia's kind of gotten lucky in the fact that, Kirby Smart, as a relatively young head coach, one of the things he's proven to be pretty good at is identifying these young guys who are rising stars in the ranks. I mean, he worked side by side with Schumann, so that was a little bit easier to identify. I think Trey Scott's turned out to be a pretty good defensive line coach. I think that Dan Lanning, one of the reasons why he's probably in line for a raise and one of the reasons why he may have forced Georgia's hand in terms of actually hiring him as defensive coordinator is there's a chance that he could have been somebody's defensive coordinator. I believe he may have even been a recruiting coordinator at Arizona State. The truth is I don't have his resume memorized or something like that. You may check that for me. But this is a guy who had a chance to go out and be, probably some other jobs and some other roles, and so he may be in line for a raise because, he may have successfully leveraged some outside opportunities. It's just an example of, Kirby kind of getting on the ground floor of a guy who may be a fast riser in the ranks here.
Same can be said for, Del McGee. He was a running backs coach at Georgia Southern. And
yeah.
He, got bumped to the interim job and then
didn't
get the full-time job. And then Kirby brought him in, and he's, been a fantastic asset to the Georgia football program.
And it's easy to forget this. It wasn't that long ago that McGee was just a high school coach.
Yep.
I mean, that's a high school coach in Georgia that people knew really well as a high school coach. And all of a sudden now, he is what he is. That's another example. Travis Ellis says, what about Tony Elliott or Jeff Scott? Scott, I don't know, but these are the Clemson coordinators. Scott, I don't know as much about, but I don't believe that Tony Elliott is leaving for anything other than a head coaching job, much the same way that Chad Morris left.
Elliott was heavily involved with that Georgia Tech coaching.
You certainly get the impression that he was, which is kind of ironic. I mentioned Chad Morris. If Chaney gets the $1.5 million deal from Tennessee, as Connor put on Twitter, that looks like it's going to make him the highest paid offensive coordinator in college football. But it wasn't that long ago that Morris was making about $1.5 million. So it's kind of funny. Apparently, I don't follow this, that closely every single year. But the high watermark for offensive coordinator salaries, I guess because a lot of these guys are becoming head coaches, it's actually kind of gone down a little bit because Chaney will be the highest paid now, but I don't know that he would have been the highest paid a couple of years ago.
Right. So in 2018, the highest 8 paid assistant coaches in the country, they were all defensive coordinators, which goes back to the point I made earlier about how if you're a really good offensive coordinator, you tend to not stay an offensive coordinator for long.
Let me get Monty Moon's comment because I think it's really interesting. This is on Facebook. He says, thoughts, BA? I know we just lost 3 fantastic wide receivers in this past year, but I'm really excited about the guys coming up. Holloman, Demetrius Robertson, Tommy Bush, Matt Landers, Trey Blunt, Dominic Blaylock. Here's the one thing a lot of folks got mad at me about in the offseason, but I have to continue to maintain my belief on. I think that Georgia has an incredible collection of good wide receivers. I think that Georgia is still looking for its great wide receiver, and one of those names you mentioned may become that. But if you really want to look at why some people were dissatisfied with the Georgia offense, to me it's not Jim Chaney's play calling. It's the absence of what we see at the college football playoff level in terms of wide receivers. I've written about this. Every team that's won a national championship, every team that's made the playoff, for the most part, but certainly every national champion, the college football playoff era, has that 900 to 1,000-yard receiver, that guy that goes out there and just challenges defenses and is a matchup nightmare. And Georgia just didn't really have that. As you mentioned, Georgia lost Hardman and Ridley. Those are 2 really good players. but neither one of those guys had more than 600 yards receiving for Georgia this season. They were both, somewhere in like the mid-fives, 530, 540, 550, something like that. Those were your two leading receivers for Georgia this season. So maybe some of that's to blame on Jim Chaney for not cultivating that guy. Some people may say, well, James Coley at one point in time was the wide receivers coach. Now that's Cortez Hankton. Whatever. I think the thing that's keeping Georgia from having won a national championship is nothing to do with Jim Chaney's play calling. It's the absence of that just NFL first-round draft pick wide receiver. That guy has been missing. Even you want to go back and look on the 2017 team. That first-round type wide receiver wasn't even on that team. So, Monty, I agree with you that the list that you just mentioned are filled with possibility. But Georgia needs more than a collection of a few good receivers. It's got to have somebody step up as a great receiver, somebody that just blows the top off a defense, especially when safeties against Georgia have to spend so much time worrying about the running game. Safeties have to sort of creep up into run coverage against Georgia. That ought to open the door for a truly elite wide receiver to emerge at the University of Georgia. And as of yet, that just hasn't happened.
I do think Dominic Blaylock's going to be that guy, though.
I think it'd be great to hear. Boy, it's exciting to hear. And when you see the highlights he's put together, it's easy to understand why some people feel that way.
So I have two fun but dumb questions. So earlier, we mentioned the Georgia. You were talking about if you could pick between paying coaches and a new football building, and I think that new football building is going to get built at some point.
Yeah.
If they do put a putt-putt course in there, which assistant coach do you think would have the course record, and which Georgia player do you think would have the course record?
All right.
And feel free to weigh in the comments.
Yeah, please.
I'll read the best ones.
Yeah, a Georgia coach playing putt-putt. The one thing I will say is Kirby's very competitive. I could see him being very intense playing putt-putt.
I think Kirby would call some mulligans and maybe skirt the rules a little bit.
Yeah, there's an old story about Magic Johnson, the great basketball player, that if you played pickup with him, you could not beat him because if he was losing a game, in pickup ball you call your own fouls. He would just call his own fouls until his team finally won. You just couldn't beat him. Something tells me that Kirby Smart may be a little bit like that. You just can't beat him in a situation like that. I'm also a big believer that if you're going to have a putt-putt course, like I'm sort of a putt-putt aficionado. Mm-hmm. One of the things that kind of bothers me about like sort of touristy putt-putt courses is that there ought to be a legitimate way to get a hole-in-one on every hole. Mm-hmm. There ought to be some sort of like bank shot you can.
So you don't want any of those par four holes. You want a true.
I don't mind it being difficult. I don't. But a putt-putt course needs to have a legitimate path towards a hole-in-one. That if you ricochet off this, and if it goes off that, and goes off that, there ought to be a scientific formula that can lead me to get a hole-in-one. But some of these goofy golf tourist attractions, it's all just sort of designed for aesthetics. There's no actual path towards a hole-in-one, or at least not one that could be easily conceived by the minds of men.
John William Adams for future players. Rylan Godey, scratch golfer, very good athlete.
I could see him being good at that. Dom's a pretty good golfer too.
Dom is a good golfer as well. Yeah.
Although, I think golfers would say that putt-putt's a very different sport than actual golf.
Yeah.
Because the club face on a putt-putt putter is a lot smaller than these big mallet putters.
I'm a terrible golfer, but I'll give you a run for your money in putt-putt.
I'm not bad at that. We actually should have like one of these days, maybe like when life finally settles back down, we don't have controversial offensive coordinator searches, things like that. We should have like a DawgNation Olympics or something like that. We'll have putt-putt and bowling, and I could see something like that being really fun. Ooh, Brandon Jackson's got a really good point. I could see Nolan Smith being very good at putt-putt. Mm-hmm. I could see him taking every dollar from
I feel like
his poor teammates. I think he could rob them blind. I could see that being really good. Cliff Hancock says, I think that Demetrius Robertson can be an elite wideout. Now that he's got some experience with us, I think there's a chance that's true as well. I think 2018 was a year of learning for Robertson, but I do think there's a chance that that could happen for him. I think the stuff that he was penalized for is legitimate. I don't think this is just Kirby Smart wanting to be a heavy-handed coach. I think he legitimately and with good reason needed to see more from Robertson. Maybe in 2019 you'll get that. Philip Jordan Wells also brings up a really good point. If you're going to have that like sort of DawgNation Olympics type thing, the air hockey thing's got to be a big part of this. Now I'm I'm very particular about air hockey rules. I don't abide, and my son does this all the time. It drives me insane. I don't abide the trapping. You can't trap the air hockey puck. You can't pick up your hand, what do you call it, paddle or whatever, and then trap the puck and then hold it still and then hit it. You can't do that. You got to play it as it lies. This younger generation, man, we got to work on these guys and gals because some of them cannot play air hockey. So that would have to be a big part of this as well. And I would say that I'm above average as an air hockey player, better than some, not better than others, as you might be surprised to find out. My reflexes aren't the quickest, so I know that may be a shock to hear. So sometimes I leave the net not exactly as well tended as it needs to be, but I'm not bad. I'm not bad at air hockey. I'm not bad at that.
Mark Cochran brings up ping pong. I think that has to be in there as well.
I'm not good at ping pong.
I'll give you the business in ping pong.
Yeah, Jennifer Stevenson Fleming also mentioned that as well. I am not a good ping pong player. Never have been.
Casey Cochran wins cornhole. I feel like Jake Fromm would win that in a runaway.
Oh my gosh, Jake Fromm.
He'd take all your lunch.
I could see Charlie Werner being very good at that. I could see Jake Fromm being very good at that. My guess is they probably played a decent amount. Adam Hart Palmer says skee ball. I can't decide if skee ball is actually a game of skill or just blind, stupid luck. I cannot decide. I cannot decide if there's a way to actually get a perfect roll on that. Scott Madison Baker says foosball. That's not a bad game to play. Once again, though, I guess I'm like Marion the librarian when it comes to all these rules. But I can't have the people who just sort of like spin the knobs.
No, you
gotta control it when it comes to this kind of stuff.
Can't play like a 6-year-old.
Nick Bonanno says, what about a rock climbing wall? There's one thing I can promise you I'm not going to be able to do, and that's that rock climbing wall. Every now and then, because we'll go with our kids to the park and stuff like that, my kids all like the rock climbing walls, you'll see. And sometimes I'll sort of try it just a little bit. I can't get much over 2 steps on that deal before I'm having to get back down. So
steering the conversation back to football, and we talked about elite receivers. There's been some stuff brought up about Demetrius Robertson. I don't know how much this year is a referendum on him, just because he came in so late. It wasn't clear until about halfway through spring camp or fall camp he was going to be a part of the team, or he was going to be a part of the team and potentially a part of the offense this year. And I think by the time he learned the playbook and learned sort of what Kirby wanted, they were already so deep in the season, and it was already clear that Riley Ridley could be trusted, Mecole Hardman could be trusted, Jeremiah Holloman, Terry Godwin could be trusted, and it became difficult for him to sort of break in, by that midseason point.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways when you look at Robertson, J.J. Holloman took his spot. I mean, Holloman was a physical player. Holloman, had an ability to go out and get the football. I mean, some of the one-handed catches we saw from Justin Ross in the national championship game, J.J. Holloman made a lot of, I don't want to say similar catches because, obviously Ross is pretty spectacular. But Holloman's ability to go up and pull the ball out of the air at its highest point, I mean, he is incredibly strong there in that regard. And I think that kind of charting a different path because he was not like a top 5 player coming out of high school or anything like that, but a guy that was, what you hope is the pathway for Georgia. He, grew a little bit as a freshman. He learned a little bit as a sophomore, and maybe in his 3rd year, he's really, ready to take that to the next level. I mean, certainly from a physical standpoint, he looks the part. So I've got a lot of hope in J.J. Holloman there as well. But I think the overall point here should be that when you look at what ails the Georgia offense in comparison to the teams that won national championships, you cannot diminish the role that just a dominant wide receiver plays in all of that. You just can't. Let me go over to a YouTube here for a moment. Jacob Thompson also brings up an interesting point that with Mecole Hardman being gone, is there a chance that Robertson emerges more as a kick returner next season? I think that's a really interesting thing to bring up.
Blaylock would be a name to watch there as well.
That's really interesting to think about too. So I think that Blaylock is really interesting there in that regard. Let me get some more here. Thomas Roberts says, I hope with our new offensive coordinator sticks with what we do best, running the football. I don't want to see us turn into a team that strictly wants to throw the football spread. So this is one of the challenges of being, an offensive coordinator like Jim Chaney, because you can have some people who say, oh, he's too conservative, he runs the ball too much, and you have some people highlighting the LSU game point and say, hey, he abandoned the run during that game. I mean, the one thing that I do believe the next offensive coordinator is going to do, to go along with the point from the commenter, is this is still going to be built around the running game. And by the way, every program would do that. if it had the offensive line that Georgia has and the running game that Georgia has. Every coach would do this if he could. Most coaches can't. So this, the reason why the spread has been adopted as far and wide in college football as it has is because that was the only alternative, because most programs don't have the talent, and by talent I mean just the kinds of guys at these various positions. They don't have the kind of talent to do what Georgia does. But if they did, that is what they would do, because game planning is a lot easier. I mean, one thing we kind of take for granted a little bit is, if you go back and look at 2017, 2018, it's easy to fixate on what happened against LSU this year, or what happened against Auburn in November of 2017, or what happened in the second halves against Alabama. It's really easy to fixate on that. But what can be easy to forget, and shouldn't, is Georgia virtually never plays a close game against anybody. It just doesn't. All coaches understand that Kirby Smart's preferred game plan is the easiest game plan to ensure an easy victory. If you can line up, maul people, and run the football, you are virtually guaranteeing yourself an easy win against overmatched opponents. And for the most part, Georgia plays overmatched opponents. There's a huge reason why Georgia does what it does. It doesn't have to sweat out games against South Carolina. It doesn't have to sweat out games against Missouri. Even on the road this year, it still won by 2 touchdowns. It doesn't have to sweat out games. I mean, Florida's a top 10 team. Georgia won that game by 19 points. Kentucky, top 15 on the road. Georgia won that game by, a huge margin. Let's not forget the fact that Georgia's preferred game plan is a great way to obliterate overmatched opponents. And all the cosmetic stuff, it would be more fun if Georgia was doing this, more fun than doing that. There are some inherent risks when you go smaller, lighter, and faster. There are just some inherent risks. Football games become a little bit of a toss-up. I actually don't think Georgia fans want to live in that world where, you're like Oklahoma, scoring 50, giving up 45, and sweating out a 5-point win at the end. I just don't think you want to live in that world. The Georgia offense has created a scenario where which most games, the fourth quarter is pretty boring because it's already been decided that the other team is so outweighed and outmatched, and that is why the Georgia offense is likely going to be, very much the same as it was, even the new offensive coordinator.
2 points on that. Analytics have shown us that, you win about 50%, and just over the course of time, you win about 50% of one-score games. Georgia only played one-score game this year, and they lost. Texas this year played 10 one-score games, and they went 7-3 of those games, which you'll obviously take. But when you play, just by playing that many games, you do have the 3 losses that you incur.
A little bit of variance. You could be 3-7 just as easy.
And Justin Grant, to sort of pivot to the offensive coordinator, he brings up Matt Canada as a potential candidate. He was the relationship with him and Orgeron was so toxic and so bad his 1 year at LSU. I just have a hard time seeing him being a real fit with what Georgia wants.
You're talking about Matt Canada?
Matt Canada, yes.
Yeah, so, the thing you got to remember about Canada at LSU, that got so bad. This has been verified. That got so bad between Canada and Orgeron.
That was bad quickly.
Yeah, it got so bad between Canada and Orgeron that Joe Aliva, the LSU AD, had to chaperone their meetings. I mean, that's how bad that it got. And as my buddy Mike Johnson's pointed out, that's not the only school in which Canada's worn out his welcome. So, keep that in mind when it comes to this. Brandon Willis also brings in an interesting comment, and I want to spend a couple minutes talking about this. So Brandon hears, this is on Facebook, he hears what I say about Georgia's ability to dominate overmatched opponents because of the offense it runs, and he says, yeah, and I'm paraphrasing, yeah, but Georgia's got to find some way to adjust against its equally matched opponents, because you can make a case that Georgia has not done that particularly well. It split in 2017 with Auburn. It got blown out for the most part against LSU. It faded 2 games in a row within the same calendar year against Alabama. Connor, and I want everybody to kind of weigh in on this. Do you think that's a valid criticism that while Georgia built an offense that could dominate overmatched opponents, including good teams like Florida and Kentucky, it just hasn't always, stood toe-to-toe with equal teams as well as it could?
I don't think you can say that this year. I mean, I know the LSU game was bad, but I think that may have just been more just because I have questions about how well that team as a whole was prepared for that game. But they went toe-to-toe with Alabama, and, Brom threw for 300 yards, and they had pretty good success running the ball. They just couldn't finish drives in the second half of that game. And, against Texas, I just think that game, again, sort of like the LSU game, the coaching staff just, they came out flat. They were never really interested in winning that game.
Matt Rukavina on Facebook says, BA and Connor, remember, since we are keeping Pittman, it shows we want to be an offensive line dominant run game first team. The new offensive coordinator will have to fit with that ground and pound. We're running back university. Matt, I think you're right about that. And I think the evidence, as we understand it, does indicate that is indeed what's going to happen. But it does point back to what we were just talking about. What about the LSU game where Georgia abandons the run? I mean, sometimes online you see these oral histories. If I could commission an oral history of that LSU game, I'd love to know what really happened there, because I do think that understanding that game, I think, does give you more insight into understanding what really is going on at Georgia, including the second halves of the two Alabama games where Georgia could not hold on to the lead. In some respects, that issue sort of seems defensive related because of the differences in the quarterbacks after the 2017 season, Jalen this year. But if you could understand why Georgia just had such a baffling, inexplicable game plan against LSU, I think it would help understand some of this a little bit more. I do. It's also worth pointing out that in the midst of all of that, you get the fake field goal, which I don't think you can blame on Chaney at all. I don't think he went to Kirby and said, "Hey, boss, how about we fake a field goal?" I don't think that'd even be his call to make there. So if I could have a oral history of here's what really happened at LSU, I'd love to know more about that, because the honest truth is it is beyond my football understanding to understand why Georgia did some of the things that it did that day. They showed a lot at the line of scrimmage. Georgia just completely checked out of the running game altogether, but didn't orchestrate a very effective passing attack either. A complete outlier to the rest of the season. I will admit, I don't fully understand what happened there that day.
I mean, as bad as the offense was that day, too, I mean, the Georgia rushing defense gave up 275 yards. Now,
a lot of that was in garbage time, though.
Yes, but, it was a one-score game in the fourth quarter. And LSU had success running throughout the game. The total yardage might be, but that LSU game, to your point, it's a weird game. And 2 years in a row, Georgia's gone into an SEC West opponent. 3 years in a row, really, when you throw in that Ole Miss game, Kirby's first year. He's gone on to an SEC West stadium, and Georgia's had the doors blown off.
Yeah, it's true. Miriam Martin-Corbin said she was at that game. She said Georgia looked scared that day. It did not look like the same Georgia we've seen in all these other games. And as Connor's alluding to, it's one of those rare moments when Georgia truly faced something of a hostile crowd. And even with 20,000 Georgia fans there that day, and there probably were that many, even with that many Georgia fans, it was still kind of a hostile crowd, and Georgia has not responded in those environments very well. Blade Bino Brown says, going back to the other issue, what about the adjustments in the big games that we can't win, BA? I'm assuming that mostly means Alabama in the second half, because those are the games that could have really changed a lot for Georgia. I mean, you would certainly say the adjustments for the Georgia offense against Oklahoma, for instance, were outstanding in the Rose Bowl. You may say, well, that's a much easier defense to navigate than Alabama, and you're probably right about that. Listen, Alabama doesn't give up 30 points to a lot of teams. I don't know that Georgia scored less against Alabama than the typical good teams expected to score. Would they get 28 this past year?
Yep.
Or this past December?
Should have at least gotten 31. I mean, the Rodrigo.
Even Rodrigo himself would admit that's a kick that he makes 99 times out of 100. So you should have been in the 30s there. I mean, even though most of that came, early in the game, early in the first half. I mean, is there an expectation that you're going to score 40 against Alabama? I mean, Clemson did, but I don't know that anybody's going to do that with regularity there. Dwayne Williams says it was 5 field goals. I don't consider a blowout against LSU. Offense kept the defense on the field. By the end of that game, boy, I'm standing down on the sidelines when it's over. I felt pretty blown out by the time that was over with. But maybe that's just semantics.
I don't know if we've talked about it on the show yet. How awful and how much fun as a Georgia fan did you have when Alabama ran what I think was a worse fake than Georgia did in the championship game? So
I think that was actually a pretty telling moment. You're talking about the fake field goal that Alabama ran. Chris Fowler on television called it right before it happened. Clemson, more importantly, had its defense on the field. I mean, it's so similar to the fake punt. right down to the thing with Mac Jones, who was the holder on the play that you even heard, I think, Herb Street say, well, if you're going to run it, you've at least got to throw it. I mean, it's almost like to the letter, the same description, Georgia's fake punt, Alabama's fake field goal, but the overall reaction to it was almost to the letter the same way. What I think about that is, it just goes to show you that Kirby Smart's fake punt, as dumb as it was, is not necessarily a byproduct of his inexperience as a head coach. I think in the moment, errors in judgment are capable of being made by all coaches, even someone like Saban, who has universally agreed to be one of the greatest of all time. I think down there on the sideline, you were not making just one decision; you were making 10 decisions at once. And I think that need to juggle a lot of different scenarios makes it more likely than not that at some point in time you will leave yourself very vulnerable to a blunder. And that's what Nick Saban did. Now, what I hope would happen is for guys like Saban, and to a certain extent Smart too, you hope they might add a dash of humility into their public persona a little bit, because we have seen now with both these guys, they didn't exactly invent football. That football, has a way of humbling everybody, Saban included here. You would hope they would add that into their public persona just a little bit, because there's no doubt Smart's decision in December, Saban's decision on Monday night cost their teams. But if you're a Georgia fan tired of hearing, that fake punt rubbed in Georgia's face, Saban's fake field goal means I think it's likely you'll hear a little less about that in the future.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that.
All right, let's do a couple of more, then we're going to get ready to get out of here. Let's see if we can find some stuff. Dapper Dance's fourth downs beat us against LSU. Yeah, they went for it a lot that day. Converted. Georgia also had a hard time on third down there that day, too. And Dave Aranda is a good defensive coordinator. That may be an example of some of the lack of adjustments y'all were talking about. Kelly Burnett says that, and I guess Tram Dickerson's also been talking about this, too, that Chaney didn't make the necessary adjustments against the Texas defense. That was a bad game. To say that, that was a deal breaker for Georgia with Chaney, given the fact that really nobody showed up in the Sugar Bowl, would seem to be a little unfair. Chaney was not the only one who had kind of a deficient performance there that day, but I understand where you're coming from. I do. Kristen Phillips says, what happened to the Chaney flea flicker? We scored off that so many times in 2017, didn't run it once this year, if my memory serves me correct. They did try a flea flicker. It was the only time, I believe, or it was certainly the first time. I don't know if it ended up being the only time. The first time Demetrius Robertson got targeted all year was a flea flicker against LSU. And it was a really weird play. I think it was actually ruled incomplete, but it wasn't even a deep pass. It was a flea flicker, ended up being a relatively short throw to Robertson. That's one of those moments where you're like, boy, this really isn't Georgia's day. They can't even run a flea flicker for 10 yards. So they did try it against LSU, but it did not really work. In fact, it didn't work at all. It was incomplete.
You've made this point before, but in that LSU game and even in that Alabama game, those trick plays reek of desperation.
They do. Yeah, I don't like trick plays. So sometimes when they don't work, people think that's just reacting in the moment. I want you all to hear me now, not because I'm right, just because I believe it emphatically. The next time Georgia runs a trick play, I want it to be on record. I don't like trick plays. When you have 5-star offensive linemen and 5-star running backs and high 4-star quarterback, just run a regular play. And if you can't get it done, then it ain't your day. I don't like trick plays. Now, flea flickers are a little different than trick plays because, that's at least executed by the regular offense. But when it comes to faking field goals and
the Philly special,
Philly special and stuff like that, I'm not into that kind of stuff. I just want good players to run regular plays. I'm very old school there in that regard. Although this is probably something I shouldn't be all that proud of. I went on a Texas podcast before the Sugar Bowl and predicted on that show that Texas would run the Philly special against Georgia, and they did. That was a very specific prediction that I ended up being correct about. So Kid says, does Coach Smart stay with the pro-style look? Georgia's obviously going to have a different name at offensive coordinator next season, but I don't think anything with the Georgia offense is going to be that different. Do they play a little more no-huddle from time to time? Maybe they do. Obviously, Fromm's comfortable with that. Isaiah Wilson maybe a little less so. Andrew Thomas maybe a little less so over the course of the long haul. But for the most part, I don't think it's going to change all that much. I don't. I think we see a blueprint for Georgia that they think kind of works, and ultimately that's what I think they're going to build around. Mark Davis says, I wonder if Kirby called Nick and said, will you call a fake kick so I can get these folks off my back? Listen, it couldn't have worked out any better for him if it did. Winfred Steinspring, remembering back to that game against Mississippi State where that flea flicker worked really well to Terry Godwin. It was great to see. James Lum Moon says we looked better running an up-tempo offense. I won't deny that when Georgia ran it, it always worked. I am a big believer, though, that if you stick with that for the full game, there is a price to be paid for that. Your offensive linemen are going to get more fatigued. Your running game might suffer. And if your running game suffers, your defense is going to suffer. And for right or wrong, better or worse, Kirby Smart's not going to put his defense in harm's way just to create an offense that's more aesthetically pleasing. He's just not. As of right now, this is the formula that Georgia's going to try to use to win a national championship. By 2019 or 2020, if that has not worked, they may reconsider this whole ordeal at that point in time. Maybe they go smaller offensive linemen, more up-tempo offense, and have an offense that resembles some more of what you've seen around college football. But as of right now, Georgia has built its team to go after this thing a certain way, and they have been close in both these years. Even if it's a new offensive coordinator, I don't see a big reason to change the formula that Georgia's trying to work with. It may not work, but that's the plan that I think that Georgia is going to kind of make here. All right, we'll get ready to wrap up. We appreciate you being with us on the program today. We'll have a lot more at DawgNation with all of this. We'll also have Before the Hedges coming up at 3 p.m., and if we just made this show a little longer, we could roll right into Before the Hedges. But I have been on the air now for what seems like 15 hours in the last 12, so let me hop off for a minute, grab some lunch. We'll see you back here for Before the Hedges later on today. Stay close to the forum.DawgNation.com. Stay close to DawgNation.com as well. Chip, Mike, Jeff, I have a lot of reporting on all this kind of stuff, and when stuff happens, we'll break in and talk to you some more about it. Thank you all for great comments and a great conversation. One of the cool things about this show is I know this audience all wants the same thing, for Georgia to be the best it can possibly be. And with some new looks in the coaching ranks, we'll see if the Dogs can indeed get that done this upcoming season. We'll talk to you tomorrow right here on DawgNation Daily.